there's no way for those plants to get from the one to the other. How does that happen? Things move. The Next Great Migration is another interesting book that's recent. And that, you might think, well, is that about the migrations of people coming from places on the planet that can no longer live there because of the changes in climate there. But no, it's not just about people migrating, it's about all kinds of life migrating. So the plants that no longer can live at a certain place seem to have died off, but guess what? They show up in Seattle, or they move, they migrate too. So the Next Great Migration, in fact, what she actually points out in this book is that life has always migrated. It's always migrated all over. As things change, life migrates. But here's the interesting dilemma that Hume comes up with. It's not God. I mean, at least you can't prove it. The one argument that Aquinas gives, that it's teleological or purpose, design. You can just ask, how do you know? And that argument just falls apart. The cause and effect arguments, stuff is happening, stuff happened before. And the reason this stuff is happening is because of that stuff that happened before, and that stuff happened before, and that stuff happened before, et cetera, et cetera. But you can't go all the way back ad infinitum, because that would mean time is actually going in that direction instead of this one. This is an argument that goes back to Aristotle, and everyone accepts it all the way through. And David Hume says, how do you know? Well, how do we know? We have a memory of events. So for example, this is actually, he uses billiards. I'm going to use pool because I never got to really play billiards. But in pool, I set my cue ball on the table. I have my shot all lined up. I take my cue, I take the shot. It happens mechanically, right? Now, if I have the table set up exactly the same way and I put the cue in exactly the same place, take the cue ball, and I shoot the cue ball again in exactly the same way, same thing happens. Same thing happens. Do this multiple times, right? And as long as I'm setting the table up, there's no earthquake while I'm taking the shot, et cetera, et cetera. Is Mount Spur still okay? Just checking. I didn't bring a mask with me today, just in case. I guess I see you've got one on your head. That's good. Actually, I could do this. That'll work. Wet it first. I can imagine, Hume says, that as I'm shooting the cue ball at the 8-ball, just before the cue ball hits the 8-ball jumps up into the air and goes, "Ha ha, you can't get me!" And the cue ball goes right on by and says, "Hey, you can't do that!" and falls into the pocket. Scratch. What just happened? Well, if you saw Who Framed Roger Rabbit, you know that I went out of reality and into a tune. But what's really happening there is I'm using my imagination to imagine something else happen that isn't the normal cause and effect relationship. David Hume points out, well, if I can imagine something else happening, then the necessity in the cause and effect relationships is not logical necessity. If it were logical necessity, I couldn't imagine something else happening because it would be a contradiction. And David Hume argues that we can't hold a contradiction in our head. as both are true. I mean, that might eventually become a problem, because when you go European, you realize that they do hold simultaneously that this is true and that this is true, even though they look like contradictions. But what they're keeping in mind is that in this context, this is true. In this context, or this interpretation, this is true. I can understand both contexts, can believe both people, that think opposite things. I can understand that, right? And what I think is true is that these people think this and these people think this, right? That's my escape route, right, that way. That's the sociological perspective. These people believe this, these people believe this. Well, which one is right? Well, the right interpretation is these people believe this and these people believe this. No, but what do you believe? I believe these people believe this. You annoy the heck out of people because they want you to make a decision. And it's like, well, but I'm coming from a perspective where I'm viewing societies as each having their own context and their ethnic beliefs and their right? So, what do you mean? What's really happening? You have to be within a context to say what's real, right? And I am in a context that says what's real. What's real is that societies have social knowledge. Reason is a social, the sociality of reason, as Terry Picard calls it, right? So it's what we mean by true is truth within a context, and that's true. Chelsea.
I know this is not completely related, but I was like, is this like related to kind of like visualization? I mean, like kind of in a way to reach your goals. I know it's like not completely related, but do you have any like?
It is related.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
That you might not think of yourself as necessarily thinking this is what my society says I ought to. No, your society offers you tremendous freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And this one, right? There's a lot of societies out there where you only have one task ahead of you. I'm supposed to plant rice, and this is how I'm supposed to plant it, and this is when I'm supposed to plant it, etc. We don't have that. It's almost like Malcolm Gladwell. When you're shopping in Freddy's, and your task is to bring home some spaghetti sauce. She says, if you're married, right, and a male, and you look, and there's so many kinds of spaghetti sauce. You're like, I got to call her on the phone and say, which kind do you want? Because there's, Prego, no,
Prego, yeah.
There's all different kinds. And you got to figure out which kind. I'm paralyzed by choice. And so are you. What do you want to be? Says the high school counselor.
Yeah.
I'm paralyzed by choice. In this culture, that's a real dilemma for people, right? So that's exactly right. There's so many different, because what's right for you is dependent on everyone will say what you like, what you have to have your passion in this. Well, that's dependent on a particular perspective. Other people might say, no, your job is to get married to a husband and do what he says. That's exactly the opposite of what I would actually suggest. I would recommend that the husband marry you and do what you say, because let's face it, you're the smarter one. Typically, of course, if you read Jane Austen, you realize that even if they're supposedly doing what their husband says, they're actually manipulating the husband so that the husband's doing what they say. Right. That's high school. Girls deliberately act dumb to be more attractive to boys. Is this true?
100%.
That's the response I always get. The girls all say, yes, we do. We deliberately act dumb because if we're as smart as we know we are, the boys will not like us. Nobody likes Hermione, until like about year 4 or something. Right? Well, you get the idea. Well, if my imagination allows me to conceive of something else happening, then it's not a logical necessity when we talk about cause and effect necessity. So then David Hume says, well, what kind of necessity is it then? If it's not logical necessity. Well, it seems that it's our memory. Our memory remembers the previous times that I did this. And that teaches me to trust my memory and to expect the same thing to happen. However, and David Hume points out, our memory has sometimes failed us. And believe me, as you start getting older, it fails you more and more. It does. So if we're using our memory as part of the proof that something is the case, but your memory can't be trusted. Most of the time it can. And David Hume is actually very practical. He's a very practical guy. His main target in this argument are people that are philosophers that think that they have demonstrated this is true based on their memory. And he points out that actually, since memory is fallible, lies to you, if you've got 5 people at an intersection, famously, who is the one that caused the accident? You get 5 different explanations, right? That being the case, you can't trust your memory, so if the memory of previous events is part of your proof, and that's science, right? I tested it this way, you guys go test it, and they go test it, and based on your memory of what happens, we discover that that's what our memory tells us happens too. That's good science, but it's not proof. That's why it remains a current hypothesis. In the official language of science, you don't actually say you have proved something. If a scientist says that he's proved something, everybody figures, unless he's talking in math, where you can actually have proofs, because that's a deductive closed system, basically. Not completely closed. You've got infinite numbers and so on. But nonetheless, you've got rules, and you have to follow the rules so you can prove something in math. But when you're talking about even hard sciences, memory is the standard. And okay, that we accept this. We can duplicate it. You're talking about fusion versus fission, or have problems over that. Did I get that right? Or is it fusion over fission? Or did I say it the same way both times? One, everything blows apart. The other one, everything comes together. And the theory is we can make everything come together and get just as much power from it, but it's not going to blow things up. So it'll be great. We could use that. And they've been trying that for hundreds of years. Well, maybe not that long. But you get the idea. There's problems with memory. So the standard form for a science is to talk about, this is our current hypothesis. And in fact, the thing that everybody wants to do is try to test it and test it and test it and see if they can find something wrong with it so they can come up with a superior hypothesis that's even better and gives us more devices, smaller memory larger memory capacity in a smaller device. In fact, you mentioned that we even now have a new matter, thanks to those folks trying to create quantum computers, which I think are now on sale. But I think you have to be a company large enough to have lots of money to buy one. And plus you have to be a company with the kinds of problems that might help. I don't know which kind of problems that actually might help. So basically, the necessity that I typically have associated with my cause and effect believes my arguments, is my memory. I remember them happening this way. But since my memory is possibly lying to me, that's not a proof. It's not a logical proof. And as a result, strictly speaking, we can't prove empirical things. In fact, a lot of people will feel like that shows that the cause and effect arguments for the existence of God don't succeed as well, right? That's why I like to emphasize the ontological argument, because that's a strictly a priori argument based on the definition of God, which seems to not only prove that God must exist, because God by definition is that than which nothing greater can be thought, but other things as well. So like the greenest thing, that than which nothing greener can be thought. That than which nothing sweeter can be. I mean, take any of those words you like and expand on it, and it seems that those things must exist. Even the worst thing, that than which nothing worse can be the case, that has to exist, actually, according to our language. Which doesn't mean that it doesn't exist because it's just merely verbal or dependent on English or dependent on an observer who thinks that. I mean, the beauty of language is that it's a tool that enables us to know stuff about the real world. So, and if you think about it, it just means, well, at least the universe exists. And if there's anything bigger than that, that must exist. So it's just kind of, it frustrates people to heck because, well, but I want God to look like, you know, the European paintings of Jesus. Did I mention that the one lady in, I think, the Philippines was arrested because she said Jesus ought to get a haircut? Did you hear that? She's been arrested and she's in jail for 2 years because that could cause all kinds of social unrest. Not to mention all the folks that feel like if you say things about Muhammad or depict Muhammad with a turban with a bomb on it, or all those kinds of things, there are people who will issue a fatwa or order that whoever feels like it should kill them, and if they succeed, we'll give them $1 million, or So, you can't prove things in science. Instead, it's just hypothetical, which is why Kansas has a problem, because the parents that wanted the schools to only teach them what they knew for sure was true were frustrated because the scientists have been trained socially not to argue that they know things for sure. That's contrary to the contemporary mood in science. That's really part of what makes science so dynamic, is that people are constantly double checking and seeing if they can find errors in whatever theories are already being accepted and taught, etc. Well, the problem, according to Kant, what's the easiest way to do this here? See if I could do this. Oh, maybe I have it here. Let's see. So there's 4 different terms here. A priori is simply Latin for what was before.